Sweet fuck of the Lord, shit cunt Jesus. Focus on the family, donate, give monthly. Home, faith, spiritual life. Don't all good people go to hell. Don't all good people go to hell. By Robert Verlard, January the 1st, 2009. Oh look, all those people are going to hell. Those who argue that all good people go to heaven then make the case that a loving God would not turn away good and sincere individuals. Instead, they reason it's obvious that he would send them all to hell. In this series, is Christ a total cunt? 2. What about those who have never heard? What about those who have heard and go, oh, fuck off, Jesus, get a life? 3. What about hypocrites in the church? After 3 is 4. Is hell real? 5. Don't all good people go to hell? 6. How can God allow so much evil and suffering? Because he's a cunt. In John 6:38, Jesus said, For I have come down from heaven not to do my will, but to do the will of him who sent me, NIV. 6 times in John 6, it's stressed that Jesus came down from heaven, underscoring not only his divine origin, but also that his purpose is to do God's will. The Greek word translated as heaven is ioannis, and in context refers to the dwelling place of God, period. In Christian theology, it is also where the redeemed will dwell. There is a common perception that so long as one leads a generally good life, they will get into heaven. But the question, don't all good people go to heaven, presupposes a number of points. First, there is usually the assumption that God exists and that he is all-loving. Second, there is an assumption that although some bad people may need punishment, most people are generally evil, and as such are entitled to hell. Third, there is a view that entrance into heaven is on the basis of merit, our works, rather than God's grace. I get confused because I have found it always difficult to understand exactly what grace is. I understand the Protestant point, and possibly you could say it's a fundamentalist point on the understanding of what exactly the word fundamentalist actually really means, the fundamentals of the faith, that you're saved by faith, you're not saved by works. You don't go to heaven because of God's grace. If grace just means graciousness, kindness, and giving freely, then of course you go to heaven because of God's grace. I think that's meaningless, and a lot of religious stuff is completely meaningless. Christianity, especially, I swear to God, there's a very good argument to say that, as I understand it, it seems to be, if it's a religion, there are rules, like there's 10 commandments, period, and we're giving you some rules. Now, if you break the rules, you go to hell. If you keep the rules, you go to heaven. That's nice and easy. But my understanding of Christianity and a lot of what people are preaching is that it's got nothing to do with works, essentially. It's about faith. It's very confusing. Fourth, related to the question about heaven is the implicit suggestion that hell, if it exists at all, and that is another question, hell, heaven, and surely if hell exists at all, surely heaven doesn't exist. And lots of people are coming to the polite conclusion that it's all a shitty waste of time and that Jesus never actually really existed and the whole thing's a load of cunt. Fourth, related to the question about heaven is the implicit suggestion that hell, if it exists at all, is really only for a marginal few who are responsible for particular evil acts, like heterosexual marriage. Let's briefly look at these points. God exists and is all-loving. If that's true, then there's no point trying, and it's a load of shit. That God exists is an obvious component of the Christian worldview. He not only exists, but is also creator, designer, and sustainer of the universe and everything in it. Not only is he ever-present, all-knowing, and all-powerful, God is also all-loving. He is a personal being, active in his creation, but distinct from it. Those who argue that all good people go to heaven then make the case that a loving God would not turn away good and sincere individuals. Instead, they reason it's obvious that he would allow them into heaven. This position, however, fails to consider the broad spectrum of the nature of God. This position, however, fails to consider the broad spectrum of the nature of God. While we may glean general principles about him from what he has made, Romans 1:20, such as his existence, power, and moral nature, we learn specifics about him from the Bible, his special revelation. It is here that we learn that God is indeed merciful, Deuteronomy 4:31, Daniel 9:9, but also just Job 34:12, Psalm 45:6, Isaiah 30:18. He is also completely holy. These aspects of his nature, particularly his justice and holiness, mean that anything even remotely sinful cannot dwell in God's presence. Most people good? The next assumption is that although some bad people may need punishment, most are generally good and entitled to heaven. The position that views people as generally good and entitled to heaven tends to make the error of viewing human nature as basically good. Biblical evidence as well as experiential evidence shows this view to be false. As the Bible explains, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Jeremiah 17:9 KJV. Psalm 51:5 comes across even stronger. Surely I was sinful at birth, sinful from the time my mother conceived me. Basically speaking, most people are not good. In fact, when compared to God's standards of holiness, no one is good. To one degree or another, we all fall short of the glory of God, Romans 3:23. This does not mean that we are always actively engaged in doing evil or participating in depraved acts all the time. Oh yes, it does. I am always participating in depraved acts. I consider anything to do with fucking Jesus or the Bible a depraved act. This does not mean that we are always actively engaged in doing evil or participating in depraved acts all the time. But it does mean that in our very nature we are fallen in rebellion against God and incapable of saving ourselves. Works and grace. The view that entrance into heaven is on the basis of merit, our works, rather than God's grace, is also common. The view that entrance into heaven is on the basis of merit, our works, rather than God's grace, is also common. But a works-based system of salvation is foreign to the message of Christ. Whether or not one enters heaven is not dependent on a continuum of good and evil, wherein we hope our good acts outweigh our bad ones. While this perspective may be common, it is biblically incorrect. As Ephesians 2:8-9 reads, "For it is by grace you have been saved through faith. This is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast." NIV. Grace is God's unmerited favour, demonstrated most fully, spelled wrong should be FOOLY, in the sacrifice of Christ. In short, the only way to heaven is through Jesus, the way and the truth and the life, John 14:6. Those who argue that all good people go to heaven often suggest that if hell exists, it is reserved for a minority of particularly evil people, like Israel Folau. But since most people are not so evil, they argue it makes sense to claim that all good people will get to heaven regardless of any minor lapses in moral behaviour. Does this reasoning hold up? It does so only if it fails to take into account the nature of God, the nature of sin, and what the Bible has to say on the subject. As we've noted, God is holy, but he is also just. God's justice requires the reality of hell for the unredeemed. The nature of sin extends, biblically speaking, to everyone. Salvation is not by works, but by God's grace through Christ. What if you're sincere? What about sincere and good people who are not Christian? See the articles in this series, Is Christ the Only Way? And what about those who have never heard, for related information? Won't God welcome them into heaven? This assumes that sincerity is enough to correspond to truth, when in reality it is not. As Proverbs 16:25 reads, there is a way that seems right to a man, but in the end it leads to death. As Proverbs 16:25 reads, there is a way that seems right to a man, but in the end it leads to death. Sincerity will only get someone so far, then it must face reality. No matter how sincere someone may be about being able to fly by frantically flapping their arms, their sincerity will not keep them in the air. Besides, if someone is actively believing something that is not true, and as a result is implicitly, if not explicitly, rejecting God, it seems odd for God to welcome such a person into heaven. Sincerity then is not enough. One also has to believe what is true. No one is God except God alone. Fuck, this is long and I'm getting fucking bored. Jesus fucking Christ. Like the bitch who approached Jesus and used the word good, perhaps without giving it much thought, we need to be careful how we use and define our terms. As Jesus answered, no one is good except God alone. Mark 10:11, Luke 18:19. Do all good people go to heaven? Since no one is good as defined by God, the answer is no. Those who enter heaven do not fuck. Those who enter heaven do so not on the basis of merit, but on the basis of God's grace, as bestowed by Jesus Christ. We can't work our way into heaven or claim to be without sin, 1 John 1:8. Instead, we must humbly submit to God, turn from our wrong behaviour, and turn to Christ for salvation. Copyright 2009, Robert Villard, used by permission, all rights reserved. Topics, New Christians. About the author, Robert Villard. Robert Villard, bit sexy there. Robert Villard is author of Conversations with C.S. Lewis, InterVarsity Press, The Heart of Narnia, Nav Press, and Inside the Screwtape Letters, Baker Books. He studied philosophy of religion and apologetics at Denver Seminary and is pursuing graduate studies in philosophy at Southern Evangelical Seminary. More by Robert Villard. Previous first steps in the Christian life young adults consistently express. Something about hetero marriage. Did Jesus like hetero marriage? No. If you follow Jesus, Jesus never got married. He wasn't interested in women. He never got married. He died at the age of 33 and he was a total fucking loser. Don't follow him.